flew into Glasgow from Dublin in the late afternoon and drove north up to Archer at the head of Loch Long and booked in to the old classic hotel there, and then joined my brother Harry and my sister-in-law Kath for dinner at the local pub. The first stage for the day was to get to Oban in order to catch the ferry to Mull. However, looking down Loch Long showed lots of rain and mist for us going over the rest and be thankful. Thankfully, by the time we reached Loch Fyne, the weather had cleared a bit. And just before we reached Inverness, we came across this old bridge, still serving the house. We arrived at the Oban ferry terminal a little ahead of schedule. We were booked onto the lunchtime service from Oban to Craignure on the Isle of Mull. So we picked up our tickets and joined the queue. I've always liked Oban, and we could also see where we'd stayed on our last visit. Soon our ferry arrived. I love watching these guys work. They make it all look so easy. Before long, we were loading on, and the lounges were actually quiet when we arrived up there. They did get a little bit busier, but it was a beautiful day for sailing. And after about 20 minutes, Mull came into sight. Sailing along the coast, we passed Duart Castle, and soon after we arrived and we drove out and on to Mull. Our plan today was to drive north to Tobermory and then across to the Mccrory Mausoleum, then back down to Craignure and across to Fionnport, which is a very long, slow, single-lane road. We happened to find a nice lookout just before we got to Tobermory. It allows us to see the beautiful scenery in this area. The main street, Tobermory, was quite busy, and at the far end of the inlet was a modern marina. We drove back down to Grewline and found our way to the Mccrory Mausoleum. It was actually about half a kilometre walk along this trek, and then through a couple of gates. Now the upkeep of this is paid by the New South Wales government, and it's actually in very good condition. On one side of the mausoleum is a dissertation to Mccrory himself, and I thought that the little Australian flag was a very pleasant touch. And on the other side was all the burial information. After about 1.5 hour drive for the 75 kilometres, we arrived at our guest house in Fionnport. The view from our window was splendid, so we decided to walk down to the harbour. Now, Highland Kettle are the lawnmowers here, and this one obviously had an itch. The ferry to Iona had stopped for the day, and just as we were leaving, the sun shone on the rocks across the water, turning them into this beautiful salmon colour. Today we were to visit the island of Iona. It has been the centre of Christianity since the 6th century. It's only a 10 to 15 minute ferry ride across from Aviemore. The first ruins we came across was the Nunnery. This started around 1200 AD and prospered for about 350 years. This little room was the only one that was ever heated, even during the winter. A little further down the road we came to Mcclain Cross. This was erected around 1500 AD by the Mcclain clan to show their support for the abbey. A little further along the road we came to a gate leading into the Abbey Cemetery. We'll visit that after the abbey. Now there's been an abbey here on this site since about 563 AD. Not anything remains of the original buildings. In front of the abbey stands a 9th century St. Martin's cross, one of the best preserved Celtic crosses, and also a replica of the 8th century St. John's cross. There's only some of the original fragments left in the museum. It's thought that some of the pilgrims washed their feet in this trough prior to entering the abbey. St. Columbo's shrine, through this doorway, dates back to about the 9th century. The actual great church dates from about 1200 AD and was restored in the early 20th century. The Book of Kells was written here around 800 AD. With the original now in Dublin, this is a replica on show here. And there's several grave markers dating from around the 7th century. Bakery and brewing house, but as it's on line with the Street of the Dead, where the funeral marches moved to the cemetery, it may have been something more important here in earlier times. The graveyard itself is the burial site of many Scottish kings, as well as those from Ireland, Norway and France, and the 12th century chapel contains some grave monuments. I was unable to find out whether this was a fireplace or a window frame. Further along we want to climb up Dun 1, which is a hill, to get views of the island. And it's a good scramble up to the top. But the views make it all worthwhile. Today we will get the ferry back to Oban, and then onwards to Fort William and Spain Bridge. We stopped to look at Duart Castle on the way to the ferry. The main keep was built around 1350 AD, and the castle fell into repair, but restoration was started in 1910 by the 26th chief of the clan Mcclain. A walk into the scullery / laundry shows you the thickness of these walls. And had their own way of dealing with troublemakers. Being a wet day, the visitors were mulling around the main living areas. Don't you think this bedroom's a little bit over the top? We were in the queue for the ferry in good time, and soon we left Craignure for Oban. Just before we reached our guest house at Spain Bridge, we came across this commando memorial. This area apparently was a training ground. On the Saturday morning, we went to the village of Kells, to the west of Fort William, to do some washing, and while waiting there we had great views to Fort William and the loch, and up to the cloud-covered Ben Nevis. Once the washing was done, we headed round to Glencoe, popping into the boat club area, before driving up through the glen. Drove around to the Ben Nevis Mountain Resort and took the gondola up to the mountain. This is a very popular mountain biking area. Once at the top, we took the pathway up to the lookout. Great views from up here. And we could look down on Fort William. Soon we were heading back down in the gondola. What a nice way to finish our day. This morning we were driving up to Port Augustus to look at the Caledonian Canal, then west onwards to the Isle of Skye. Just short of Fort Augustus we came across this lovely little suspension bridge. After the flood of 1849, when the road bridge was swept away, it took 5 years to build this bridge, the Bridge of Oik. At Fort Augustus, most of the action is around the road bridge. And on the other side of it are 6 locks, which bring the boats down to the level of Loch Ness. Watching this happen is a spectator sport. And once all this action is finished, the locks fill themselves back up again. Back on the other side of the road there's a track that follows the canal out to the start of Loch Ness. And across the other side is what I imagine would have been a little lighthouse, guiding boats into the canal. From here we drove through some beautiful country on the way to Skye, and just before we arrived at Skye we got to the most photographed castle in Scotland, Iona I. I've added some more photographs to that. At Nunnery, our hotel set on the water's edge at the harbour. Today's destination was Inverness, and with the bad weather around it meant we couldn't do any walks, so we decided to go up to Uig. When we woke and looked out our hotel window, we could see the rain and quite a strong wind blowing. This is really a very isolated area. On our way to Inverness, we stopped at this nice burn. Some places here look really remote, but even in these conditions, we love the scenery. In the evening at Inverness, we walked along the towpath, this time on the opposite side of the road bridge from our last visit. And after a kilometre or so, we arrived at the marina. And a little bit further on, we arrived at the locks, taking the canal down to sea level at Inverness. The weather was a bit better this morning, so we decided to take a cruise down Loch Ness before driving round to Aviemore. We had to head a few miles down to where Loch Ness ends and the canal begins, and we waited for a ferry to do some manoeuvres, and soon we're heading out to the loch proper. Soon we pass the Bona lighthouse. Eventually we arrived at Uig Castle. This castle saw much military action from about the 1200s until its demise in the late 1600s. Robert Bruce had control of this at one stage, and it was a government garrison during the Jacobite Rebellion. When the last soldiers left in 1692, they blew it up, and part of the Grand Tower crashed to the ground in 1715 following a violent storm. When we arrived at Carr Bridge on the way to Aviemore, we were taken with this carving, but much more so by the old Packhorse Bridge. This was built between May and November in 1717 to allow crossing when the river was in flood. It was badly damaged in the 18th century, and especially in the famous flood of 1829. From there we drove round to the Cairngorm Gliding Club, where I'd hoped to go for a fly, but it was all locked up and no one there. We were spending the day around Aviemore, and for our first stop was the Strathspey Railway. This steam railway runs on 10 miles of track from Aviemore to Boat of Garden and on to Broom Hill. Broom Hill is famous as Glen Bogle in the TV series Monarch of the Glen. Soon we were off, and before long we were heading through the countryside. Boat of Garden was our first stop, and here the loco had to take on water to last him the rest of the day, I would think. Soon we were off again, and on our right, the River Spey. Once we reached Broom Hill, the loco changed ends. And pulled us back to Aviemore. We drove up to Grantown on Spey to have a look at the museum. And actually it was a very pretty Scottish town. It's amazing what you see on the way to the Cairngorms National Park. And here we took the funicular railway up the mountain. Probably the best way to do it. At the top, there's a restaurant and a viewing area. And the showers down in the valley were very clear. So we had basically a lit lunch in the restaurant, and then we headed back down. A really nice way to finish our day. Today we're travelling to Aberfeldy and would take us over and around the Cairngorms with stops at the Balmoral and Bryn castles. Just loved this road. And we did have our share of narrow roads and narrow bridges. And I wondered just what this old building could tell us. At Balmoral we parked the car in the car park and walked over the bridge. The Queen was in residence there, so the police didn't look too keen for us to get any closer. So I guess I just had to use this photograph. A little further on is the golf course. And here's a great par 3. The tee up the hill on one side of the road and the green on the other side of the road. A great hole. Next, we stopped at Bryn Castle. All the rooms that are open have been kept very much as they would have been 100 years ago. I love this curved door. This room is very interesting because it had in the window boxes some graffiti from when it was an army garrison in the 1700s. And as with any good castle, it's somewhere for those who misbehaved. The scenery as we drove to Aberfeldy was great. And after we booked into our hotel at the resort, we walked into town. Lovely. Today we're heading back round to Glasgow, but stopping off at Stirling to look at the castle. But when we arrived, we couldn't find a car park near the castle, so we end up driving over to the William Wallace Memorial to take a look at that. And when we returned, we managed to get a car park, so we strolled up past the statue of Robert the Bruce and up into the castle. This is a really big castle. There's lots of buildings and lots of squares and courtyards and gardens. All the gardens were really nice, and from here we could look down on the outer defences. With Harry and Kath, we took a trip down to the border country, the Gretna Green, and then back by Selkirk. Now this bridge is the border between England and Scotland, and for many years young couples from England eloped and crossed it to marry here at the old smithy in Gretna Green. Still a very popular place to get married. We stopped off at Langholm for a break. This is a lovely town. It's got a really good community culture. From there it was to the nice border town of Selkirk to get some afternoon tea at the bakery. And we noticed that the bakery and several other shops had beautiful knitted displays. We all headed off to Edinburgh on the Sunday to go and look up the Royal Mile and around the castle. To get there, we used the park and ride and took the tram into the city. Being a Sunday, it was very busy, so we headed over the Prince's Gardens and up to the Royal Mile. There were lots of tours and people everywhere, especially near the castle. Nice views from the ramparts, and we just took a quick look inside. And then we returned to walk back down the Royal Mile. The Monroe ladies are not a group to be messed with, and a very pleasant way to spend an afternoon. Monday morning was very wet, but we drove over to the little hidden gem of Culross, then on to St Andrews. Now Culross really is a hidden gem from its cobblestones and its narrow streets, and the great little cafe where we end up having lunch. To its townhouse or toll house with its own prison. A really nice place to visit. Then we went off to St Andrews to walk along the cliff and down to the harbour. There are lots of ruins all around St Andrews, and I'm sure these statues were taken many centuries ago. I love this old stone bollard. St Andrews, a really wonderful way to finish our touring in Scotland.